Hey, this is Steve Bell with the MedTech Mavericks podcast. On today's podcast, I'm going to give insights into how to sell a surgical robot. Specifically, I want to talk about soft tissue surgical robots that are used in laparoscopy because that's the area of knowledge that I have. I'm not going to talk about other surgical robots such as spine robots because I don't actually have any personal knowledge of those. I'm sure, though, that some of this will be applicable because it's really about selling large capital equipment. And it is worth getting to the end of the podcast because I will give you the secrets on how to close a deal for selling a surgical robot. So hope you'll stay with me for the whole of the podcast. I started my journey with surgical robots back in about 1998 when I was looking at a surgical robot when I was within Johnson & Johnson. I then did a lot of laparoscopy work, open to laparoscopy. I've sold in that area for a long time. And I've also sold in the area of heart failure devices, so fairly large, complex capital equipment. The journey with the robot started again back in 2015 when I got involved with a robotic startup company. And I've just got a big experience of setting up the entire commercial structure within these robotics companies. And it was a path that was trod in a way that was fairly new. Intuitive have been out there selling robots for a long time, so there was some understanding. But it's a very different game when you're trying to sell a surgical robot against a large incumbent as well. So you have to modify slightly. I imagine that a lot of the process is the same whether you're selling an intuitive robot or you're selling a new startup robot. I think that the market approach is going to be the same and the sales approach will be the same. And today I'm going to focus right in on the sales approach. There is a wider commercial approach that I will talk about in coming podcasts, including marketing. But today I actually want to talk about the selling process. So this might be interesting to people who are out there who are about to go and sell surgical robots, or people who are creating companies out there that are thinking that they're going to take the challenge on of selling surgical robots in the next couple of years. And this process should apply whether you're a big multinational company or whether you're a small startup company. Let me start by giving an overview of what it takes to sell a surgical robot, a multi-specialty surgical robot for soft tissue. You are effectively going to try and change an entire service in a hospital on multi-departments. So that's why I believe that this is one of the biggest challenges that you'll ever do in medical device selling. And part of the problem of this is that what you're selling one of the most expensive pieces of capital, multi-million-dollar robot. You are selling consumables. So you'll have the instruments that are consumables, you'll have the drapes, but you'll also be selling in there the semi-reusables, you'll be selling in their disposables, you'll be having to talk to the sterilization departments, you'll have to talk to the nursing departments, the OR departments, the finance department, the C-suite. And it's a major change of service that you're going to have to do. And that's really what you're selling into the hospital. I think, having done this for 30 years, this is the single hardest sell that you can do in the surgical arena. It's just the biggest mountain to climb. I think it's a little bit easier in 2024 than it was back in, say, 2019, because there are more choices out there now, so that the surgical market is more open and the hospitals are more open to having choice of robots. And there is a larger installed base of competing robots to Intuitive. So that just helps a little bit the mindset of the market. Plus, I think we're at a tipping point where most hospitals in healthcare systems, especially teaching hospitals, realize they have to have a surgical robot. So you're getting a little bit more market pull than in the early days when we started with this, in terms of back in 2015 and way before then for Intuitive, people were saying, why the robot? I have a whole blog on the site for why people will want a surgical robot. I don't hear that so much anymore now. It's more now asking which robot and why that robot. So that's helped a little bit. But saying that, it's still going to take you between 6 months and 2 years to sell in the entire system. And it's not a single individual person that can sell the robot. I don't believe that there's a hero rep that sells this anymore. There is obviously somebody in the company that's going to lead the charge and is going to be the kind of the lead point on the sale, but it takes the entire company now to sell a surgical robot, because you're going to have to talk about all kinds of things, from the marketing, from the clinical, from the CSSD side of it, which is the sterilization services. You're going to have people come in and talk about the connectivities. You're going to have your IT side of things covered by your team as well. And that can't all be done by a single person. In my mind as well, it's no longer a rep to surgeon sell, although we'll cover that a little bit. It's really a business to business sell. It's your business company selling a major change of service and a partnership to a hospital. So that means that it's really a team approach rather than an individual approach. And you're going to have everybody throughout the company, from the CEO all the way down to people who are bringing the kit in, that are going to have to be involved with this sale at some point. So the sales cycle for this can be compressed down. I've actually seen some robots sold where people have got money and need to get a robot quickly and have been thinking about it for a while. And the sales cycle can be compressed down to about 3 months. But generally, it's going to take you anywhere between 6 months, more likely 18 months, and it's going to take up to 2 years. And I've seen some deals in the past be over 2 years to 2 to 3 years. And it also depends which country you're selling into, and it depends which type of sale it is, whether it's to a private hospital who can make a decision faster, or whether it has to go through a public procurement, such as a tender. So all these factors will influence how long it will take. But what I will say is, if you're in the game of selling surgical robots, expect it to take anything up to 18 months on average. And my estimate would be that you need about 500 interactions with the hospital, the surgeons, the nurses, the C-suite, a total of about 500 interactions, calls, mails, follow-ups, demos, all of this, to be able to get a deal over the line. I think it's just so massively intense. And if you're not prepared to wait for that, then you shouldn't be selling a surgical robot, because this is not like selling anything else. And I know that everything is hard to sell in 2024 because of all the red tape you have to go to. And it's not like selling back in the 90s. But this is just, it's not another league, it's another sport. That's all that I can kind of tell you about this. You really have to understand, you have to approach this in a completely different way. And then you've got to think about all the servicing and the implementation and all that, which I'll cover in some other podcasts. But today I want to talk really about some of the main things that you have to do to get that 18-month to 2-year cycle in. What are some of the 500 touch points that you have to do? And basically just give you my insights on what I found you've needed to do to sell that soft tissue surgical robot. One of the things that you're going to have to really set off and understand is that this is multi-specialty. One of the things that I think is different potentially, and please correct me if I'm wrong, between an orthopedic surgical robot and a soft tissue surgical robot is that in soft tissue, you might have to talk to thoracic, general surgery, upper GI, colorectal, gynecology, urology, hepatobiliary. So you can end up having to convince multiple departments that they want a robot. And this is where it gets tricky, because different departments may also want a completely different robot. So you might have one that wants robot A, and you want another department that wants robot B because of the features and the functions of the robot. And now you're going to have to try and, in your sales pitch and the way that you sell this, try and bring those groups together to agree on one single robot, because they're potentially not going to buy multiple, although that is coming. Once you've got the surgical specialties, at least with some form of alignment in your head, you are then going to have to deal with the second group. The value of the purchase and the change of service is at such a level that this impacts really all the way up to the CEO of the hospital. So you're going to have to basically work with the C-suite of the hospital. So the CEO, the CFO, the CCO, the COO. And that means then you've got a purchasing group and a user group that need to get together. And generally what I've seen works well is when you have the creation, or there is the creation of a robotics user group, which is led by one or two key surgeons. But quite often on that robotic user group, you will often see a C-suite member or a couple of C-suite members that are helping to drive that change in service. But generally, if you want to have a successful sale of a robot into a hospital, you are going to have to, if it doesn't exist already, you are going to have to create that group. Fortunately, many of those groups already exist because they have previous robots within the hospital. And they're quite often heavily driven by urologists because they're seen as the main user of the robot, especially in a hospital that's really trying to expand its service across many of its specialties. So you'll often have the urologist who will lead that. And that can give a problem if you're a company bringing a new type of robot, because they will have a loyalty to their intuitive robot because that's what they grew up on, that's what they understand, and they get really good usage out of it. So it might be hard for them to understand why would you want any other form of robot. But in other specialties, other robots with other architectures may actually have some advantage over the intuitive. So this is going to be a bit of a problem for you when you get that user group. But this leads into one of the key things that I think you need to understand fundamentally. So you need to understand, why do they want another robot? And a few years ago, it was generally into two camps. One was that they needed to upgrade their older robot to a newer robot. And then the second reason was that they actually needed to acquire a first robot. So there's many reasons why people want to get a surgical robot. It could be that they're upgrading their older urology robot. There's a couple still out there that they want to upgrade. Or they want, there's not enough robotic time available for all of the specialties. They want to expand their services and get second or third robots in. Some hospitals really want to attract surgeons. They can't attract surgeons because they don't have a robotic service. If they're a teaching hospital, they may want to have multiple specialties with multiple types of robots so that they can say that they're a multi-robot. There's lots of reasons why a hospital would like to buy a surgical robot. And your job is to deeply, deeply understand that motivation, because that will really change the way that you pitch and how you pitch. And I can't give you the exact details today because it would depend which robot you're selling, and it would depend on one of those motivations. But your first thing is find that deep motivation. The motivation also is not just pure surgical. You have to understand whether or how much of this is a surgical motivation, that surgeons want to get into the robotics and use the robot to do better surgery. But you also need to understand whether this is driven by the hospital management, because they need a robot to be able to offer the full services, to be competitive. You really need to understand not just the motivation, but who are the key people driving that motivation, because they're the people who are going to stand by your side and help you to drive this through a really difficult 18-month period of trying to convince the organization to part with a couple of $1 million, pounds, euros, and really invest in changing their service, because they're going to have to do training, retraining. There's going to be a whole set of things that change in sterilization. There's going to be a whole pathway flow. So they have to be incredibly motivated, and you have to understand who's motivated and keep them motivated throughout that whole process. So once you've got that M sorted, you go on to a second M, which is money. You are talking here about, millions and millions of dollars, pounds, or euros of investment over potentially a 7-year period. That money doesn't just grow on trees. The hospital will have to find money for it and justify the money and justify the budget of where it comes from. And the money can come from many different places. In some places, there are charity funds where charities are asked to buy the initial capital, and then the instruments and the servicing and all of that is paid for out of the hospital. Sometimes it's pure private, and basically they'll pay for it out of the private funds of the hospital. Sometimes it's from a capital fund. Sometimes it's from government funds. And sometimes I've actually seen it from things like European funds that have funded different research projects in robotics. So you need to really understand deeply, find out, follow the money. Where does the money come from? And what does it take to release that money into the system so that it can be utilized against the robot? And then before you get too far into the journey, first of all, you've got to make sure they can pay for it and they're willing to pay for it, because it's going to cost you and your company an absolute fortune to get them through the process of deciding if they're going to buy a robot or not. It's a really expensive selling process for you as a company in terms of hours, people, money, demos, all of these things are going to cost you a fortune. So you better make sure that at the end of it, they can actually really pay for it. And they're not just being curious and then trying to work out, well, we'll try and work out how to pay for it later. And then as models have changed with selling robots, you have to understand, how do they want to lay that money out? So do they want to deploy capital? Do they want to take on a rental? Do they want to take on a long-term lease? Or do they want to have a full managed service? And you need to understand that really early on, because that will really form part of your selling process of how you're going to sell the deal in. And any company that's not offering all of those options today is going to struggle in this market. It's the economics of this change dramatically depending on whether you sell capital up front, whether you put this out on a lease, whether you do a rental, whether they're doing a cost per case. All of these things have huge impacts, and you'll also have to have a blended array of these sales, because you can't only go and do one, because hospitals might not take it that way. But if you load it all into one type of sale where you're not getting capital up front, if you're a small company, you're going to risk running out of money pretty quickly. Once you've got that sort of motivation, money sorted, you're going to need to understand the more negative sides. And you could call that another M, which could be the moaning. So you're going to have a lot of people who are going to put barriers up to this, the barriers of why they don't want a robot, or the deal killers. So, for example, they want to raise charity money to buy a robot. If you don't raise the charity money, that's a potential deal killer. Another deal killer for you might be that they are trying 3 different robots and they just decide that the format of a competing robot is just way better for them. That's a potential deal killer. You'll also have people who are very close with other companies. So if you're competing with company X and you have 2 surgeons in there that are just incredibly close to company X and they love their products, they love their service, they are trainers for them, a whole host of reasons why they would prefer to go with company X instead of going with you. You need to uncover that early on. What you don't want to do is spend hundreds of thousands going all the way through a process when all you're being used for is a way of getting the price down when it comes to the price quote. Understand that early and kill those deals early, because my experience is, if there is somebody so tied to a competitor and they have the major decision in this, then you are just not going to change that. And it's pointless going right through this fight, especially in your first sales. Don't take that on as your mountain to climb. Go and find the people who really are, they're open to any kind of new robot, open to any new kind of company. And it'll just be an easier sell, because you're only going to be able to pick so many to go after at once, because it is so massively resource intense. And that means that your market segmentation and your customer segmentation needs to be superb. And I'll come to that in another podcast. I'll talk a little bit about the commercialization in general with marketing approaches. But basically what you need to do is make sure that any of those deal killers that are going to be deal killers, whether it's today, tomorrow, or in 18 months, get to the bottom of them fast. Another thing that I would suggest that you do very early on is also try and understand the site of care. Some robots will be used up in the main block. Some will be used maybe in the outpatient department, or if it's a small clinic, or if it's an ASC. Wherever the robot is going to be used, you need to really understand where's the predominant usage going to be, and do they want to make it mobile? That's another thing that's come lately with robots, is people don't want them stuck in one single operating room anymore, because you have to change the whole workflow of the hospital. And if one of the desires is that they want to move it into different physical locations, you absolutely need to understand, the process of what they're going to move, and you need to understand where it will go and whether your robot will even fit in that room. And if it fits in that room, will it still allow enough space around it that you're not going to piss off everybody in the operating room, such as the anaesthetist or the circulating team? So it's really important to find out early on the site of care where it's going to be predominantly used, and be honest with yourself. If it don't fit, don't force it. And the reason that I say that is, I've seen many robot systems, some very big ones that are trying to be put into a tiny operating room. And yes, they get the sale, but then they don't get the uses afterwards, and the robot comes back. So you need to make sure that your robot is appropriate for the type of surgery, for the site of care, and if it's mobile, try and make sure that you've worked out in the sale process. And the reason I say this in the sales process is that what you promise in that sales process, your company's going to have to live with for the next 5 years afterwards. And if you've promised them that it fits inside a tiny cupboard and it can just be moved really easily between places and even between sites, even between hospitals, and it actually can't from a day-to-day reality, you're going to be held to that. So make sure that what you're selling is genuine and you match up the needs and your robot meets the needs. And again, if you just can't do that, move on to another place and just say, hey, I don't think we can actually help you there. Let me dig a little bit into some of the nuts and bolts of the sales and the sales pitch, etc. I'm not going to talk in this podcast about marketing and the tools. So whether you've developed a VR headset, whether you've got virtual demo tools, whether you've got demo boxes, I'm not going to talk about that here. That'll be in another podcast. I'm going to assume that you've got a set of assets that your sales force or your sales team or you can physically use to try and get people excited about your product. And again, I think in 2024, if you've not got things like VR headsets, you've not got apps, you've not got AR demos, you are really a little bit behind in terms of how you're demoing your product. And I think you're missing some tricks there, but we'll talk about that in the marketing one. The one thing that I do think is critical is that you have some kind of unique selling position. That's going to be critical. And if you don't know what that is, join my course. It will tell you all about how to create a USP and set yourself aside. But basically what you need to tell people is why your robot. If this is just a cheaper copy of a Da Vinci with less functionality, that's not a great sales pitch. And again, win on price, lose on price. I don't believe, from everything I've seen, that there is such a thing as a cheap robot. And everyone comes out with that. And they all say, we're going to come in there and we're going to save lots and lots of money because, we're going to give you the capital. Ultimately, it all costs about the same. The cost per case ends up about the same. The amount of investment ends up about the same. There is no such thing as a cheap robot. And if you do end up with a very different system, so if you've got something like, a single small insertable robot, then yes, you don't have the tower and you don't but you've still got a console and you've still got the servicing and you've still got all the backup. Ultimately, I don't think anyone should be competing on price. I think that that's just a terrible, terrible way for anybody to go after. You need to find out what's the killer function of your robot that really sets it apart, and make sure that that's baked into your sales pitch, and make sure that you really know how to sell that side of it. And if people don't resonate with it, again, you're going to have to move on, because if they absolutely want a boom robot with full functionality and they want advanced energy and ICG and stapling, there's only one thing that they're going to be able to buy on the market today, and that's the XI. So just understanding your sales pitch, if you've got something unique that can really help them, it's size, it's modularity, it's the way that it works, it reduces the number of incisions, whatever it be, make sure that you've really got that nailed before you go in. Because trying to sell the general of, we're generally selling you a robot, is just not going to work in 2024. Then you're going to have to look at your demos. You're going to have to learn to demo in a very slick way. You've got to make sure that these very complex systems, first of all, are stable enough to demo. If you're out there demoing an unstable system that's alarming all the time, that's just terrible. I've seen it personally. It's just terrible when you have a demo where you have alarms going off in the early days. So again, make sure that if you're a company that's doing this, make sure that your system is absolutely stable and your demos go without setting off alarms every 2 minutes, because that'll just frustrate everybody in the room, the sales team, yourselves, your senior management, their senior management, the surgeons will all be really upset by that. Make sure you've got a dry demo, and then make sure that all users, everyone who's going to use this robot, has a demo. And I'm talking about the clinical users, including the key nursing staff, need to have had a demo of your robot so they know what they're getting into. And that can be a dry demo to start with, which can be a box with some kind of games in it. But ultimately, you're going to have some kind of wet demo. And a wet demo really can be harvested organs, it can be a cadaver lab, it can be an animal lab, it can be whatever your preferred way or whatever the customer absolutely wants to do a wet demo. But you're going to have to do it at some point. And the reason that I say that is that, moving pegs between boards gives you a feel of the way that the controls work. It gives you a little bit of idea of the vision system. But when you get into the wet demo, they start to really understand the vision system that you have and the color rendition and the clarity of your system. They really start to understand that. They also want to understand how your instruments grab, grasp, cut. They want to understand how your electrosurgery works, how it delivers energy. And they'll want to understand if you've got an advanced energy, how that works, or if you've got something like ICG, how well does that work? And dry boxes just have a limitation of how far you can take somebody to understand. And this is really their big test drive. This is really about that they want to make sure that they try before they buy. So some kind of wet demo is going to be needed at some point. And I can tell you that can become very expensive. And that can also be one of the things that really pushes out the time frame on this, because some surgeons are just not available so soon. It might take them 3-4 months and the labs are not available. But again, you're going to need to do some kind of wet demo. And another thing you're going to need to do is some kind of on-site demo for the general staff. You need to make sure that the C-suite who are backing you and signing up to this have actually tried this in the hospital setting. So you're going to need to take your system to the hospital. I don't mean use in clinical cases. What I mean is you're going to have to do some kind of demo in the hospital so that people can sort of see the size of it, the scale of it, how it all plugs in, how they interact with it. And the people who are paying for it are going to want to sit on it and actually drive your robot around some pegboards. So you're going to have to set up a 2 or 3 day dry demo within the hospital. And that really should be done for every hospital that you go to. You also want to, that's your kind of validation that it fits into their environment. So if you can do it in one of their operating rooms, even better. And to emphasize that is really when you've got to get the entire C-suite or as many of the C-suite as possible driving that robot. And if there's a charity that's being involved, you want to get the charity heads also driving the robot. It's a very emotional thing when they get to use it and see it and say, okay, this is what we're going to put our money into. And this is cool. This is so amazing. So it's really important that you get that on-site demo done and get all of the C-suite and all of the users through that within 2 to 3 days. Throughout this process as well, you are going to have to build with them a customized quote. And yes, there are, when there's a tender, there's some tender frameworks go out there and you talk about all the pieces in there. It's a little bit more than that. When you're building the quote, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to build a long-term partnership with them, and you're trying to put the financials in context of that. So you're going to really need to understand their case volumes, what they're going to use this for, and you're going to have to build a really, really strong business case for why they should deploy this amount of money over this time in the hospital. But that business case needs to be built with them. I've seen too many mistakes where people go off and just sort of do a very rough business case. You need to build that with the financial team within the hospital so that it's their business case that they're putting forward, not your business case that you're offering to them. Subtle difference, but quite an important one when you're building business cases. I may do a whole podcast with some experts who are really good at building business cases. The one thing I will say through this whole period is they're going to ask you to give them a robot for free. Not everybody does, but if you're a big teaching institution that's got 6 other robots and they'll say, well, we should have this for free. I can't stress enough, my experience is in this sales process, you cannot give a robot for free. And there's many reasons for that. First of all, you'll go bankrupt as a company if you're a small company. If you're a big company, your P&L will just look horrendous. But what it is I think part of the process of putting your hand in your pocket is that you have skin in the game as a surgeon, as a hospital. I can tell you in the first 3 to 6 months of using the robot, a lot of people will fall off the horse. And if they've had it for free, it's very easy just to say, well, I won't do this case today with a robot. Well, it was free anyway. When you have a team that's on the hook who's paying day in, day out for the robot, there's just another motivator behind them, from the C-suite, but also from the users to make sure that the bloody thing is used. So it gives a big incentive for them to use it. And what I've seen is where robots have been given free over the years, they tend to have a slower adoption and a much lower usage than where I've seen them fought for, when they've had to lay out $3 to $4 million of money, it's just a very different incentive for them to be using the robot. So again, I've never given away a robot free in my career, and I would highly suggest that no one gives it for free. Now, there are models where you deploy the capital and then you bill on top of that for cases, or that's not giving it for free. What I'm talking about is, give me a robot for 6 months, give me all the disposables, give me the service, give me everything for free. I'll write you a paper because I've got a great name and our institution has an amazing name, and we'll give you lots of data for your registry, and we'll give you lots of data for your IDE and all of this kind of thing. I think it's a really, really bad way, first of all, to do business, but secondly, in terms of having people motivated to keep using the robot. The interactions that you're going to have over this 18-month period are massive. And there's a tendency that a lot of sales teams kind of wing it. First of all, I do talk in my course about Salesforce.com and why, even though I find it such an extremely expensive system, why it's really important. But I think having a system like CRM or you need to write out a really, really detailed pathway of the sales process and have some way of following this up and planning for it. This can't be done like selling anything else. And if you've sold staplers or you've sold, this is a very, very different sell. And the amount of complexity in it, the brightest and best people in the world can't keep this in their head. So I would highly recommend that you plan, you execute, and you have a systematic approach in terms of going through the process, because you'll lose track of it. And you really need to have all these multiple stakeholders with all of the interaction points that are going to work with them. And there's a reason for this. It always takes longer than you think, because just trying to get people's diaries together, it's like trying to herd cats and trying to get 8 different clinicians, 2 different nurses, the CFO, the COO, the CEO around ski period when they're all off skiing, or during the summer break or whatever. But it just time just dilates. And if you are not really, really professionally organized in terms of managing that sales process, you will A, struggle to close the sale, and B, it will dilate to the right. So you'll end up with a 3-year sales cycle to be able to land it. And by that time, if your competition is doing better than you, then what's going to happen is they will close it way faster. And while you're still planning your demos, they'll have done the demos, closed it out, presented a business case. And if it's not a tender business, they will have closed that deal before you even know about it. Once you sign, that is really just the beginning of it, because it's the huge lift then is to get the thing to be used in a regular way. Implementation, servicing, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to cover that in the podcast today. I'm going to assume that what you've done is you've done your 18-month job and you've got it signed and you've got the paper signed and the customer's going to start with it. And that's really what I wanted to cover today. If you would like more insights into medtech, into surgical robotics, into generally medtech, make sure you sign up to my site, howtostartupinmedtech.com. And if you are starting a medtech or you're running a medtech company at the minute, then I have a full course there, and there will be more courses dropping over the next couple of months. But I have a full course there on actually how to start up and run a medtech business. And if you've got a surgical robotics business, you'll find it very, very useful, the content that's in there. So thanks for listening to the end, and there'll be some more podcasts dropping soon. Take care. Bye-bye.